Part 1. The Enigma of St. Jude's. The air in the London conference hall was a sterile, recycled chill, smelling faintly of institutional coffee and ambition. Dr. Eris Thorne barely noticed. Seated in the fifth row, she traced a line down her tablet screen. Her expression, a carefully curated mask of professional interest that concealed a deep, gnawing boredom. Another keynote, another parade of data points that confirmed what everyone already knew. Her mind was already composing the opening lines of a scathing commentary on the lack of innovation in modern neurological research. Then, the name appeared on the massive screen behind the speaker, the Lazarus anomaly. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of empirical evidence and peer-reviewed certainty, cleared his throat. The confidence that had marked the first half of his presentation seemed to have evaporated. "For the final part of my address," he began, his voice now more subdued, "I wish to present a case that defies our current understanding, a case I have followed for a decade, the case of patient X." The screen flickered, displaying the clinical details of a man named Tegan. Age late 50s, condition C4 level quadriplegia, the result of a climbing accident 20 years prior. Total paralysis from the neck down. Eris leaned forward slightly. Her cynicism peaked. This was standard tragedy, not a scientific anomaly. But then came the data. Dr. Tanaka clicked through a series of slides that made a low murmur ripple through the audience of doctors and researchers. "As you know," Tanaka said, pointing to a bone density scan, "a patient with this level of immobility for 2 decades should exhibit catastrophic bone density loss. Osteoporosis would be severe." He switched slides. "Yet, Tegan's bone mass is comparable to that of a healthy, active male of his age." Another slide, muscle mass readings. "We would expect near total muscle atrophy. Instead, while there is disuse atrophy, his core muscle tone remains inexplicably robust. His cardiovascular system, his organ function, his immune response, they do not correlate with a body that has been inert for 2 decades. Medically, he should not be thriving. Frankly, he should not be alive." The final slide was a series of brain scans, glowing in vibrant oranges and blues. "His brain activity is the most confounding aspect," Tanaka admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of professional bafflement. "We see extraordinary sustained activity in the prefrontal cortex and insula, regions associated with focused attention, interoception, and deep meditation. But this activity, while unusual, does not provide a biological mechanism to explain his physical resilience. There is no known neural pathway that can consciously prevent systemic decay on this scale. Science, as of today, has no answer." He looked out at the sea of faces. "We call it the Lazarus anomaly because, by all our metrics, the body is refusing to die as it should." The room buzzed with restrained excitement and disbelief. Miracle, freak of nature, misreported data. Eris heard the whispers around her, but her mind was already moving past them. She wasn't interested in miracles. She was interested in the unexplained data. A story was here. A significant one. Either it was a meticulously crafted medical hoax, a fraud that needed exposing, or it was a biological mechanism that science had yet to discover. Either way, it was the most compelling puzzle she had encountered in years. Her article would not be about faith or wonder. It would be an exposé, a rigorous scientific investigation to find the logical, rational explanation behind the man who was surviving the impossible. Before Dr. Tanaka had even finished his closing remarks, Eris had already booked a rental car and a room in a small Cornish village she'd never heard of. Her hunt had begun. The sleek gray of London dissolved in her rearview mirror, replaced by an endless tapestry of green. The further west she drove, the more the world seemed to shed its modern skin. Motorways narrowed into A roads, then into winding country lanes flanked by ancient stone walls and wind-battered trees. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. Cornwall was a land of rugged, dramatic beauty, and as Eris navigated the final, treacherous coastal road, a persistent mist rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the horizon. It felt less like a journey and more like a crossing into another time. St. Jude's sanctuary was perched on the edge of a cliff, a formidable structure of old gray stone that seemed to have grown directly from the rock, part monastery, part hospice. It stood in quiet defiance against the crashing waves and the howling wind below. It was a place of profound isolation, a world away from the noise and certainty of her life in London. The quiet was the first thing that struck her. It was a deep, resonant silence, punctuated only by the cries of gulls and the rhythmic roar of the sea. There were no televisions, no radios, just the sound of the elements. It was a quiet that felt heavy, ancient, and deeply unsettling to a mind accustomed to constant stimulation. A woman in a simple, dark habit greeted her at the heavy oak door. She was in her 60s, her face a serene map of fine lines, her eyes holding a calm that seemed to reflect the ageless stone of the building. "Dr. Thorne, I am Sister Alara. We've been expecting you." Her voice was soft, yet it carried an unmistakable authority. "Thank you for seeing me, Sister," Eris said, presenting her credentials with a crisp, professional air. "As I explained, I'm a journalist with the British Medical Journal. Dr. Tanaka's presentation was compelling. I'd like to do a feature on Tegan's case." Sister Alara's gaze was polite but deeply searching. "Tegan is not a case, Doctor. He is a man. He accepts very few visitors." She paused, her eyes assessing Aris's sharp suit, her expensive leather bag, the tablet clutched in her hand. "May I ask, what is it you are truly hoping to find here?" "The truth," Aris replied, a little too quickly. "The scientific mechanism behind his condition." A faint, knowing smile touched Sister Alara's lips. "I see. Please, come in. Tegan has agreed to speak with you." She led Aris through cool, stone corridors, the unsettling quiet pressing in on all sides. This was not the environment of a medical marvel. It was the environment of a forgotten faith. Aris felt her skepticism bristle, a shield against the pervasive, unnerving peace of the place. Tegan's room was as simple as a monk's cell. A bed, a small table, a single wooden chair, and a large window that framed a breathtaking, terrifying view of the wild Atlantic. The man in the specialized bed was perfectly still, his body beneath a simple white sheet showing the subtle, softened outlines of a man long immobilized. But his stillness was a lie. It was his eyes that commanded the room. They were astonishingly alive, a brilliant, piercing blue, and they held a depth of calm that was profoundly unnerving. They were not the eyes of a patient, but of a master. Eris set up her recorder on the table, her professionalism a familiar armor. "Tegan, thank you for agreeing to this. I'm Dr. Eris Thorne." She launched directly into her pre-planned questions. "I'd like to start with your daily routine. Can you detail your diet, your physical therapy regimen, the supplements Sister Alara administers?" Tegan listened with a patient stillness. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, betraying no sign of physical weakness. "The sisters are very kind. They care for the body's needs with great diligence." He answered her clinical questions concisely, offering no more information than was asked. Then he shifted the entire dynamic of the room. "But you did not travel all the way from London to ask about my meals, did you, Doctor?" His eyes held hers. "Tell me about your journey. The roads are difficult near the coast. Did the fog trouble you?" Aris was taken aback. "It was fine. I wanted to ask about your mental state. Dr. Tanaka's report mentions an absence of the typical depression associated with your condition. How do you endure the monotony? A slow smile spread across Tegan's face, a subtle shifting of muscles that seemed to radiate warmth. Monotony? He asked, his gaze drifting to the vast, churning sea outside his window. The sea is never the same from one moment to the next. The light is never the same. The clouds are never the same. He looked back at her. The room is small, but the world within it is infinite. Which world do you spend more time in, Doctor? The small one or the infinite one? Frustration pricked at Eris. This was not data. This was philosophy, a deflection. She had come here to interview a medical anomaly, but she found herself being interviewed by a mystic. She tried to steer the conversation back to facts, to brain scans and biological markers, but he would always gently turn it back, asking about her purpose, about the noise she carried with her, about the world outside his window that she had failed to truly see on her drive. She left that first meeting feeling utterly defeated, her notebook filled with useless metaphors instead of hard evidence. He was either profoundly delusional or the most evasively intelligent man she had ever met. The mystery of his body was nothing compared to the enigma of his mind. Her quest was no longer just for a story. It was to understand the man who inhabited that still, silent form. Part 2. The Unraveling of Certainty. Back in the sterile quiet of her guest room, Eris tried to regain control. She opened her tablet, creating a new file. She typed headings in a crisp, sans serif font, coping mechanism, elaborate fantasy, dissociation. She attempted to slot Tegan's poetic deflections into neat, clinical boxes to reduce his unnerving serenity to a textbook psychological response. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. His calm wasn't a defense. It felt like a state of being, as real and solid as the stone walls of the sanctuary. The next morning, she sought out Sister Alara, hoping for more concrete data. She found her in the sanctuary's small, meticulously tended garden, her hands covered in dark soil. "Sister," Eris began, foregoing pleasantries, "I need to understand his daily life in more detail. You mentioned Tegan's journeys." What does that mean, exactly?" Sister Alara straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze was as patient as ever. "Sometimes, Tegan speaks of things he could not possibly know. He might mention that the postman has a new bicycle, hours before the man arrives. Or he will describe a conversation between two novices in the chapel, in perfect detail, while he has been here in his room." Eris's skepticism flared. "That's hearsay, anecdotal? You or the other caregivers must be feeding him the information, even unconsciously. It's a common phenomenon." Sister Alara simply smiled, a gentle, pitying expression. "You are trying to measure the ocean with a teacup, Doctor? Your tools are too small for what you are trying to understand." The line was delivered without malice, but it struck Eris like a physical blow. She dismissed it as religious rhetoric. But the image of her, with all her scientific instruments, trying to capture something immeasurably vast in a tiny vessel, lodged itself uncomfortably in her mind. That afternoon, the Cornish weather, as if on cue, decided to trap her. The mist thickened into a driving rain, and the wind howled around the sanctuary, rattling the old window frames. The coastal road would be impassable, stranded, with nowhere else to go. Eris found herself back in Tegan's room. The storm outside seemed to charge the air within, creating a crucible for a deeper conversation. Tegan watched the rain lash against the glass for a moment before turning his bright eyes to her. "The storm makes you anxious," he stated, not as a question. "It mirrors the one you carry inside." He addressed her skepticism directly, as if he could see the headings she had typed on her tablet. "You think this is a fantasy, a trick of the mind to escape the prison of this body. You are not wrong, but you are not right either." He began to explain what he called his core philosophy, the inner monastery. "When the accident happened," he said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the raging wind, "I spent the first year in a hell of my own making. I raged against the walls of my body. I fought and screamed inside my own head until I was exhausted. Then, one day, I realized the truth. My mind was the only place I could ever be free. So, I stopped fighting my prison and decided to turn it into a sanctuary." He described his meditation not as the emptying of the mind that she had read about, but as an active architectural exploration. "Imagine your consciousness is a vast estate," he explained. "Most people live in 1 or 2 rooms, ignoring the rest of the mansion. They are afraid of the cellars where they store their fears, and they never visit the attics that hold their oldest memories. I have had 20 years, Doctor, 20 years to do nothing but explore the architecture of my own consciousness. I have mapped my memories, my emotions, my thoughts. I have learned to visit them as if they were physical places. I have found a state of being, a central hall in that great house, where the weather that batters the outside, the pain, the decay, the suffering is merely a distant storm. It cannot touch the core of who I am." Eris listened, captivated despite herself. It was a beautiful, compelling metaphor. But it was still just that, a metaphor, a psychological construct. The following day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bathed in a pale, quiet sunlight. Eris went to Tegan's room, determined to remain an objective observer. The atmosphere was calm, peaceful. Tegan seemed to sense her lingering wall of disbelief. He looked at her, his gaze holding no trickery, only a deep, abiding empathy. "The little silver bird your grandmother gave you," he said, his voice soft and clear. "You keep it in a box with a broken clasp? You touched it this morning before you came to see me. You worry that you might lose it?" The air left Eris's lungs in a silent rush. A cold shock, sharp and absolute, went through her. Everything stopped. The sound of the sea, the light in the room, the beating of her own heart, the locket, a tiny silver locket in the shape of a bird. Her grandmother had given it to her on her 10th birthday. She never wore it. It was her most private, precious talisman, kept in a small velvet box whose clasp had broken years ago. It lived at the bottom of her travel bag, buried beneath clothes and toiletries. And yes, in a moment of anxiety that morning, she had opened her bag, taken out the box, and run her thumb over the smooth, cool metal. A secret ritual, a secret comfort, a secret no one on earth could possibly know. She stared at him, her mind scrambling, desperately searching for a rational explanation. A reflection? Impossible. Had he heard her talking in her sleep? The walls were thick stone. A lucky guess, the specificity of it, the bird, the broken clasp. The fact she touched it that very morning defied all probability. For the first time in her professional life, Dr. Eris Thorne was confronted with a piece of data that she could not categorize, could not explain, and could not dismiss. It was a direct, undeniable assault on the very foundations of her reality. Visibly shaken, she retreated to her room, pacing the floor like a caged animal. The neat categories on her tablet now seemed like a pathetic joke. In a fit of desperation, needing to hear a voice from her world, she called Dr. Tanaka. She tried to frame it calmly, clinically, as a psychological trick she couldn't yet decipher. Dr. Tanaka's voice came through the line, a tinny, distant echo of the certainty she was losing. "Eris, you must be careful," he warned, his tone patronizingly professional. "This is classic transference. Captivating subjects can create a kind of Stockholm syndrome in a researcher. You're getting too involved. Stick to the hard data, the biological markers. Don't get lost in this anecdotal nonsense." His dismissal had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of reassuring her, it filled her with a sudden, hot anger. He wasn't listening. The scientific establishment she had devoted her life to was so rigid, so arrogant, that it refused to even consider evidence that didn't fit its existing model. She was alone with this impossible truth. Later that evening, Sister Alara found her sitting in the sanctuary's small, dusty library, staring blankly at a shelf of theological texts. Sensing the profound shift in Eris, the cracking of her skeptical armor, the nun decided she was ready. "There is something you should see," she said gently. She led Eris not to Tegan's room, but to a small, private study, unlocking a wooden cabinet. She pulled out a series of worn, leather-bound journals. "These were Tegan's from before the accident," she explained, laying them on a table. The room smelled of old paper and wood. Eris opened the first one. The handwriting was strong, confident. Tegan had been an avid mountaineer, yes, but the journals were filled with far more than climbing logs. They were the records of a spiritual seeker. He wrote at length about Zen Buddhism, about the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, about the contemplative practices of Christian mystics. The pages were filled with his thoughts on consciousness, with his notes from meditation retreats, with his own clumsy, earnest attempts to understand the nature of the mind. A crucial, stunning realization dawned on Eris as she turned the yellowed pages. Tegan's profound spiritual state wasn't a result of his paralysis. It wasn't a coping mechanism he developed after the fall. The paralysis had been the ultimate, horrifying test of a philosophy he had been building his entire life. Without knowing it, he had been preparing for this imprisonment all along. This single fact gave his incredible claims a weight, a credibility that she could no longer ignore. He was not just a patient, he was a practitioner of the highest order. Part 3, The Revelation. Eris returned to Tegan's room the next morning. The woman who walked through the door was not the same one who had arrived days earlier. The sharp, interrogating edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw humility. She was no longer a journalist hunting for a story or a doctor diagnosing a patient. She was a student, standing before a master. She sat in the wooden chair, the recorder and tablet left behind in her room. "Tegan," she began, her voice low and steady. "I don't understand, but I am willing to learn." A deep, genuine smile illuminated Tegan's face. It was the moment he had been waiting for. He saw not submission in her, but an opening. Understanding is not a thing that can be given from one person to another, Eris, he said gently. It cannot be explained in words or proven by data. It must be experienced. He held her gaze, his blue eyes clear and direct. "I cannot show you my world, but I can give you a map to explore your own." He paused, the invitation hanging in the silent air between them. A challenge to every scientific, materialistic principle she held dear. "I would like to guide you in a meditation. Will you join me?" There was only one possible answer. Yes. Sister Alara led her to a small, circular chapel at the heart of the sanctuary. The room was bare, except for a ring of simple cushions on the cool stone floor. Light filtered down from a single high window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eris sat on a cushion, her legs crossed awkwardly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Sister Alara sat opposite her, a silent, steady presence. Tegan would guide her, his voice relayed through the nun who knew his methods as well as she knew her own prayers. "Close your eyes, Eris," Sister Ilara began, her voice taking on the calm, even cadence of Tegan's. "Do not try to empty your mind. That is a myth. Your mind is a lively place. Simply observe it. Let the thoughts come and go like clouds in the sky. Do not cling to them. Do not judge them." At first, it was chaos. Her mind raced with deadlines, doubts, the memory of Tanaka's dismissive voice, the shocking image of the silver locket. But Tegan's guidance, through Ilara, was a persistent, gentle anchor. "Observe the noise," he urged. "What is its texture? What is its rhythm? It is a part of your inner architecture. Acknowledge it, and then let it be." Slowly, painstakingly, the storm of her thoughts began to quiet. He then guided her deeper. "Now, bring to mind a memory of a professional failure, a time you were certain you were right, but you were wrong. Do not relive the emotion. Simply find the memory. View it as if it were a film playing on a screen." An image flared in her mind with painful clarity, an early article in her career. She had pursued a story with relentless, arrogant certainty, convinced a new drug was a dangerous sham. She had ruined a young researcher's reputation with her exposé. Weeks later, follow-up studies proved the researcher correct. The drug was a breakthrough. Her retraction was buried on page 17. She had never forgiven herself for the error, for the hubris. She had buried the shame deep inside her. "Now," Tegan's voice continued, "walk into the film. Stand beside your younger self. Do not judge her. See her ambition. See her fear of being overlooked. See the pressure she was under. Trace the feeling of shame back to its source. It is not a monster. It is a bundle of energy, a knot of old pain. Look at it with understanding." In the safe, guided space of the meditation, something inside her broke open. She saw her younger self not with contempt, but with compassion. The knot of shame she had carried for over a decade began to loosen. She felt the raw pain of it, but this time it flowed through her without snagging, washing away years of self-recrimination. Tears streamed from beneath her closed eyelids, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, and in that moment of catharsis, she understood. This inner world, this vast, complex architecture of memory, emotion, and thought that she had always ignored was as real, as tangible, and as explorable as the physical world. She finally truly understood what Tegan had been doing for 20 years. It wasn't escape. It was mastery. She opened her eyes, emotionally exhausted, but spiritually awake. More awake than she had ever been in her life. The light from the window seemed impossibly bright. She looked at Sister Ilara, who was simply watching her, with a gentle, knowing smile. Words were unnecessary. Eris rose and went straight to Tegan's room. He watched her approach, and she saw in his eyes that he knew what had happened. He had not seen it, but he had felt the shift in her. She stood by his bed, the truth finally forming on her own lips. "It's not a supernatural power," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "It's not a medical anomaly. It's total consciousness mastery." She was piecing it together as she spoke. "You've achieved such a profound state of harmony between your mind and body, a psychosomatic unity. You have consciously, deliberately disconnected your mind from the narrative of physical decay. The stress, the depression, the hopelessness that would normally cause a body to deteriorate in this condition. They can't touch you. Your spirit's unwavering peace is what keeps your body in a state of equilibrium. You are holding it steady." Tegan did not need to speak. He confirmed it all with a simple, slow nod and a radiant smile that seemed to fill the room. "The body is an anchor, Eris," he said, his voice soft. But an anchor can hold a ship steady in a storm. It does not have to be a weight that sinks it. Part 4. The Legacy of Consciousness. Months had passed. Eris sat in her London flat. But the space felt different. The frantic energy that had once defined it was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The view from her window, a cityscape of concrete and glass, no longer felt oppressive. It was just another landscape. On her screen was the article she had spent her entire career preparing to write. Though she had never known it, it was not the clinical, skeptical exposé she had planned. The title was not "The Lazarus Anomaly Debunked." It was a beautiful, deeply personal, and philosophically challenging piece titled "The Architecture of the Soul, a Report from the Frontiers of Consciousness." In the article, she laid out the medical facts of Tegan's case with her usual precision, but she didn't attempt to explain away the inexplicable. She didn't try to prove Tegan's powers or offer a simple, digestible hypothesis. Instead, she shared the story of her own unraveling. She wrote about the locket, about the journals, about the profound, transformative power of looking within. She explored the implications of Tegan's existence, challenging the medical community to look beyond its purely mechanical view of health and to consider that the human mind might be a resource of unimaginable power in healing and survival. She was proposing that the next great frontier of medicine was not outside us, in a lab, but within us, in a sterile office overlooking the city. Dr. Kenji Tanaka read the published article in the world's most prestigious medical journal. He frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. This was not the Eris Thorne he knew. The article was filled with subjective experience and philosophical inquiry. Yet it was anchored by the undeniable, objective data he himself had presented. It was infuriating, unscientific, and yet it was undeniably intriguing. He found himself pulling up Tegan's brain scans again. He looked at the glowing patterns of activity in the prefrontal cortex, the same images he had seen 100 times. But now, for the first time, he saw them not as an anomaly to be solved, but as a map to a place he didn't know existed. The seed of doubt, of wonder, had been planted in the very heart of orthodox science. A year later, Eris stood on a different kind of stage. The lighting was warm. The audience a diverse mix of scientists, thinkers, and seekers. She was no longer the sharp-edged cynic in a power suit. She was poised, her presence radiating a quiet confidence and a deep empathy. She spoke not of data points, but of integration. Her talk, delivered without notes, was a powerful call to bridge the gap between ancient contemplative practices and modern medicine, to treat the mind and spirit not as secondary symptoms, but as primary components of human health. She had become a pioneer, a translator between two worlds that had been separated for too long. The talk ended with a standing ovation, the applause echoing with a resonance that went beyond professional appreciation. Later that week, back in her office, which now included a small meditation cushion in the corner, a letter arrived from Cornwall. The envelope was simple, the handwriting instantly recognizable as Sister Ilara's. Inside, there was no long letter, only a single, recent photograph. It was of Tegan. He was positioned by his large window, as always. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair. His body was as still as the stone of the sanctuary, but his eyes seemed to have absorbed all the light and vastness of the Atlantic Ocean before him. He was smiling, a true, serene, and boundless smile. Eris looked at the photograph, at the man who had shattered her world only to help her rebuild it into something infinitely larger. She smiled back at him, a reflection of his own peace. Tegan's journey in that small room continued, and now, so did hers, out in the wider world. The story had never been about curing his paralysis. It was about the continuation of his true legacy, the endless, unfolding exploration of human consciousness itself.